The Arctic is transforming as melting ice opens new shipping routes and reveals resources, intensifying geopolitical competition among Russia, China, and the US. Environmental risks threaten the fragile ecosystem and indigenous communities. This dynamic involves resource races, military buildup, and governance challenges impacting traditional lifestyles. Greenland's push for autonomy adds complexity due to its strategic position. Today's podcast is about the Arctic. Are you ready? Let's dive in.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going all the way up north to the Arctic.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, you sent in a bunch of really interesting stuff, analyses, strategic reports, even some news articles, all about the Arctic and how it's changing.
Right.
So you're clearly interested in like the geopolitics of it all, and trust me, it's about to get really interesting up there.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me is that the Arctic is really kind of changing right now from this kind of distant, almost mythical region to like a potential center of global power plays. And the big driver behind all of this is melting ice.
Okay, so we know climate change is impacting the Arctic, but I'm curious to hear more about the specifics, like what's actually happening up there, and why does it matter for the rest of the world?
Okay, so picture this ship sailing directly across the North Pole.
Wow.
Yeah, sounds crazy, right? But as the ice melts, new shipping routes are opening up, particularly the Northern Sea route along Russia's Arctic coast.
Okay.
This isn't science fiction. This is happening right now. And this route can cut travel time between Asia and Europe by up to 40%, potentially reshaping global trade as we know it.
That's a huge reduction in travel time. I bet that's got a lot of countries paying attention,
Oh, yeah.
especially if it means like faster and cheaper shipping for everybody.
Absolutely. In 2022 alone, 314 ships navigated the Northern Sea route.
Wow.
What's even more interesting is that 278 of those ships were Russian,
Oh, wow.
indicating just how strategically important this region is becoming for them.
So Russia is definitely in a prime position to take advantage of this new route.
Yeah.
But it's not just about faster shipping, though.
Yeah.
I keep hearing about a resource rush in the Arctic and not just oil.
You're right. We're talking about a region that holds an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of its undiscovered natural gas, and huge deposits of critical minerals like rare earth metals, which are essential for technology.
Wow.
The melting ice is essentially unlocking this treasure trove of resources, creating a whole new frontier for global competition.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Mhm.
Everyone wants a piece of the pie. And the Arctic is suddenly looking very appetizing. The sources mention Russia, of course, but also China, the United States, and the European Union. It kind of feels like a modern-day gold rush, but with icebreakers instead of covered wagons.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
Russia, with its vast Arctic coastline, is heavily militarizing the region, building new bases and expanding their icebreaker fleet. This isn't just about protecting their territory, it's about securing control over these emerging shipping routes and resource deposits, essentially solidifying their position as like the major Arctic power.
That makes sense given their geographic advantage. But what about China? They're thousands of miles away from the Arctic. Why are they getting involved?
Yeah, China might be geographically distant, but they're very aware of the economic and strategic potential of the Arctic. They've declared themselves a near-Arctic state and are investing heavily in infrastructure and partnerships, framing it as part of their Polar Silk Road initiative. Their goal is to secure access to resources and shipping routes. But this assertive approach is causing concern among other Arctic nations who are wary of China's growing influence.
And then there's the United States. Remember when President-elect Trump wanted to buy Greenland?
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of funny now, but it really shows that the U.S. is paying attention to the Arctic, too.
It certainly raised eyebrows on the world stage at the time. Greenland, with its strategic location and mineral wealth, is a focal point in this geopolitical game. The U.S. has reopened its consulate there and is actively seeking closer ties, particularly in securing those crucial rare earth minerals. It's a clear signal that they don't want to be left out of the Arctic equation.
Okay, so we've got Russia flexing its muscles, China making strategic moves, and the U.S. trying to catch up. What about the European Union? Where do they fit in?
The EU is taking a slightly different approach, focusing on a balance between economic opportunities and environmental protection. They're concerned about the potential for unsustainable development and the impact on the Arctic's fragile ecosystem.
Right, that brings up a really important point. All this activity can't be good for the environment. What are some of the specific risks that we need to be worried about?
The Arctic is incredibly vulnerable to pollution and disruption. Increased shipping traffic brings with it the risk of oil spills and black carbon emissions from ships, which actually accelerate ice melt.
Oh, wow.
And then there's the potential damage from resource extraction, both on land and offshore. Imagine pristine landscapes scarred by mines and fragile coastlines threatened by oil spills.
It paints a pretty bleak picture. It almost feels like we're repeating the mistakes of the past, rushing to exploit a new frontier without fully understanding or mitigating the consequences.
And what about the people who actually live in the Arctic? How are their lives being impacted by all of this?
You're hitting on a critical and often overlooked aspect of this whole situation. The Arctic isn't just about ice and oil, it's about people's lives and livelihoods. Indigenous communities are facing the brunt of climate change, from melting permafrost and damaged infrastructure to the disruption of their traditional hunting and fishing grounds. Their entire way of life is being threatened by forces largely outside of their control. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical maneuvering and economic opportunities. But we can't forget about the human cost of all this change. What's being done to protect the rights and interests of these communities?
It's a complex question, and one we'll delve into more deeply as we continue our deep dive.
Sounds like we have a lot more to unpack here. This is far more than just a distant issue playing out in a frozen wasteland. The race for resources in the Arctic is already having ripple effects across the globe.
Exactly. The choices made in the Arctic will impact everything from global trade and energy security to the future of the planet's climate. It's a story that's only just beginning to unfold. So we were just talking about the impact on Indigenous communities, and their traditional knowledge and way of life are so intertwined with the Arctic environment that as the ice melts and its development kind of encroaches on their territory, it disrupts their hunting and fishing patterns, damages infrastructure, and threatens their very cultural identity.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to imagine their way of life, which has thrived for centuries, being threatened by forces beyond their control. Are they being consulted in any way about these changes? Like, do they have any say in how their land is being used and developed?
Yeah, there are definitely efforts to include Indigenous voices, but it's definitely an ongoing struggle. Organizations like the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Sami Council are really actively working to ensure that Indigenous perspectives are considered in national and international forums, particularly within the Arctic Council.
The Arctic Council, that's the international body that governs the Arctic, right?
Exactly. It's supposed to be the main platform for cooperation among the 8 Arctic states: Canada, Denmark, which represents Greenland, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States. And Indigenous communities actually have permanent participant status in the Arctic Council, giving them a voice at the table.
That sounds like a promising step towards collaborative decision-making. But given the current geopolitical climate with all this competition for resources, I imagine things can get pretty complicated.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Arctic Council operates on a consensus basis, meaning all decisions require agreement from all members. That can be difficult even in the best of times, but it's become incredibly challenging in recent years, particularly with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
That makes sense. International collaborations are often the first casualty when geopolitical tensions kind of flare up. Has the war in Ukraine essentially paralyzed the Arctic Council?
While Russia is technically still a member, their participation has been significantly limited, which creates a lot of uncertainty about the future of the Council. It's a major setback for international cooperation in the Arctic, especially when it comes to addressing critical issues like climate change and sustainable development.
So if the Arctic Council is struggling, does that mean it's a free-for-all up there? Are there any other international rules or treaties that apply to the Arctic?
Well, there are international laws such as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which governs maritime boundaries and resource rights. However, the Arctic is a unique region where a lot of these rules are still being defined, which adds another layer of complexity.
It sounds like navigating the legal and political landscape of the Arctic is incredibly challenging.
It definitely is. And adding to that complexity is Greenland's push for greater autonomy from Denmark.
Ah, yes,
Yeah.
Greenland. They're essentially a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, but they're increasingly asserting their independence right.
That's correct. They're seeking greater control over their own resources, foreign policy, and ultimately their destiny. This has huge implications not just for Denmark, but for the entire Arctic region.
I can imagine Greenland is so strategically positioned with its vast mineral reserves that it makes them a key player in this geopolitical chess game.
Precisely. Their growing autonomy has attracted significant interest from countries like the US and China, both eager to secure access to Greenland's resources and potentially gain a strategic foothold in the region.
It seems like every aspect of the Arctic is kind of interconnected. Climate change, resource competition, geopolitical tensions, and the rights of indigenous communities are all intertwined in this complex and rapidly evolving situation.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a reminder that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It has ripple effects that are felt across the globe.
Okay, so we've laid out the challenges, but where do we go from here? Are there any solutions or potential pathways towards a more sustainable and equitable future for the Arctic?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
So we've talked about some of the challenges facing the Arctic.
Yeah.
The melting ice, the resource rush, the geopolitical maneuvering, all that stuff. It's kind of overwhelming. But let's shift gears now and talk solutions. Is there a way forward, a path towards a more sustainable and equitable future for the Arctic?
Yeah, I think it's crucial to remember that the Arctic's future isn't predetermined. It's a story that we're all writing, and the choices we make now will determine what that future looks like. There's no, magic solution, but there are concrete steps that can be taken to address these challenges. It's going to require a combination of international cooperation, responsible resource management, technological innovation, and, perhaps most importantly, a fundamental shift in how we view and interact with the Arctic.
Okay, let's break that down, starting with international cooperation.
Yeah.
Given all the geopolitical tension we've discussed, is that even realistic? I mean, these countries are competing for resources and strategic advantage. It's hard to imagine them putting aside their differences and actually working together.
It's definitely a challenge, but history has shown us that cooperation is possible, even when things seem impossible. Take the Antarctic Treaty System, for example. It's been remarkably successful in preserving Antarctica for peaceful scientific research for over 6 decades. Even during the Cold War, we could envision a similar framework for the Arctic, one that prioritizes environmental protection, sustainable development, and scientific collaboration.
So you're talking about an Arctic treaty of sorts, like a set of rules and agreements that all the Arctic nations could agree to abide by.
Exactly. Such a treaty could establish clear guidelines for things like resource extraction, shipping regulations, and environmental protection. It could also create mechanisms for resolving disputes and ensuring that the benefits of Arctic development are shared equitably, not just concentrated in the hands of a few powerful nations.
That sounds promising, but getting all those countries on the same page, especially in the current geopolitical climate, it feels like a monumental task.
It won't be easy, that's for sure, but it's not impossible. It requires, I think, strong diplomatic efforts, public pressure, and perhaps most importantly, demonstrating that cooperation is ultimately in everyone's best interest. If we can show that a healthy Arctic benefits the entire planet in terms of climate stability, biodiversity, and even economic opportunities, it might just tip the scales towards collaboration.
Let's hope so. Now let's talk about responsible resource management. We've discussed the risks of oil drilling and mining in the Arctic. Are those activities inherently incompatible with a healthy Arctic? Or is there a way to develop those resources in a more sustainable way?
Yeah, it's not about completely shutting down resource development. It's about doing it responsibly and sustainably. We need stricter environmental regulations, comprehensive impact assessments before any projects are approved, and a commitment to minimizing waste and pollution. There's also a growing movement toward incorporating indigenous knowledge and perspectives into resource management practices.
It makes a lot of sense. Indigenous communities have been living in harmony with the Arctic environment for millennia. They have such a deep understanding of its delicate balance, and their traditional knowledge could be invaluable in guiding sustainable development.
Absolutely. We can also explore alternative economic models that have a lower environmental impact. Things like ecotourism, sustainable fisheries, and renewable energy projects. These models can provide economic opportunities for local communities while preserving the Arctic's unique ecosystems.
Speaking of renewable energy, what role can technology play in creating a more sustainable future for the Arctic?
Well, technology is a powerful tool, and it can be used for both good and bad. On the one hand, it's enabling some of the very activities that are putting the Arctic at risk, like oil exploration in increasingly remote and fragile areas. But on the other hand, technology also offers solutions. We're seeing advancements in renewable energy technologies like wind and solar power that could reduce reliance on fossil fuels in the Arctic.
Are there any other technological innovations that could help?
Definitely. There are innovations in shipping, like more efficient engines and cleaner fuels that can reduce the environmental impact of maritime traffic. And we're seeing the use of satellites and remote sensing technologies to monitor environmental changes, track ice movement, and improve safety in this challenging region.
So technology can be a double-edged sword, but it's up to us to use it wisely and harness its potential for good. Now let's circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the importance of centering Indigenous voices and rights in the Arctic. What does that look like in practice?
I think it starts with recognizing that Indigenous peoples are not simply stakeholders in the Arctic, they are rights holders. Their claims to land, resources, and self-determination must be respected and upheld.
That sounds like a fundamental shift in perspective, moving away from the colonial mindset that has dominated the Arctic for far too long.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that Indigenous communities have a genuine seat at the table, not just as consultants, but as decision makers. Their voices need to be heard not just in national policies, but also in international forums like the Arctic Council.
And it's not just about listening, right? It's about taking concrete action to address their concerns and support their self-determination.
Absolutely. That means supporting their economic development initiatives, investing in their communities, and honoring their cultural heritage and traditional knowledge systems. It's about recognizing that a healthy Arctic is one where Indigenous peoples thrive.
So to sum it all up, creating a sustainable future for the Arctic is a complex and multifaceted challenge, but it's not an insurmountable one.
Right. It requires a collective effort, a shift in perspective, and a commitment to working together. Governments, industries, Indigenous communities, and individuals all have a role to play.
And for you listening, this deep dive has just scratched the surface of this incredibly important topic. We encourage you to explore the sources we've provided, do your own research, and most importantly, engage in the conversation. The future of the Arctic is being shaped right now, and your voice matters.
The Arctic might seem like a distant and remote place, but what happens there affects us all. It's a reminder that we're all interconnected and that the choices we make today will determine the world we inherit tomorrow.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.